um, understanding what calculation groups are and the purpose these calculation groups are used for. And I'll be going through a very basic demo in terms of how to create a calculation group as well. So that's pretty much what's in the plate for today. Right. So calculation groups. Firstly, if we understand what calculation groups are, it's a feature in DAX that allows you to minimize the number of measures uh, that follow the same calculation, logic, or expression. Now, we had talked about DAX a bit, and we had gone through DAX a bit, and we had also we had gone through DAX a bit, and we had also uh, gone through uh, a bit of measures as well. We had built measures previously, and now we are actually trying to get a step further by just optimizing these measures simply by reducing the redundancy in these measures and reducing the simply the repeating logic that these measures might carry. Right, so that is pretty much the purpose of these calculation groups. And these calculation groups are mainly used for time intelligence purposes. Now, when it comes to, I had taken you guys through a bit of time intelligence previously as well. Typically, we build measures related to last year, year to date, month to date. So all these are called as time intelligence. And the most common use case of calculation groups is time intelligence, but that does not mean that's the only use case that these calculation groups are used for. There are multiple diverse use cases that you can use calculation groups for that I would be covering probably in the next session that I get an opportunity to speak at the Tech Forum community. But today we will be just looking at the time intelligence in terms of a use case. Right. In terms, and we'll now looking at the platforms that you can use the calculation groups. You can use the calculation groups in Power BI as what we'll be doing today. And we also can use the calculation groups with Azure Analysis Services and also SQL Server Analysis Services, right? So with Power BI, we would need to install an external tool called Tabular Editor um, to to use the calculation groups feature. So Tabular Editor, nothing much complicated. You can simply Google in Tabular Editor download, and the first option you get, simply download it and just go through the wizard, very straightforward wizard, and you would have calculation groups install. You would have the Tabular Editor external tool installed in your local machine afterwards, and after doing that, it would appear in Power BI. I would show you where it appears and how it appears and everything that's related to that. But just keep in mind for now that we would require Tabular Editor in to use calculation groups in Power BI. And regarding the calculation group itself, the calculation group is broken down into two main components. Firstly, you have the calculation group itself, which would typically hold multiple items, which are typically known as calculation items. And inside those calculation groups, you have calculation items. Now, these calculation items simply store the logic or store the repeating logic in measures to be used by multiple measures. Now, if you can't simply understand what this is, it's completely fine. We would be going through the demo in which you can get a sense of everything that's going on um, with calculation groups. Right. With that in mind, I would like to get you into an example to understand the purpose of a calculation group. Now, instead of a sales model that's being consumed by the sales team in an organization, and the sales model has two main base measures. One measure is the sales amount, typically analytics with sales amount. Then afterwards, you have sales quantity, which is analytics with the sales quantity. And so this the sales team would be consuming this data model and would be taking engaging in data-driven decision making with this data model. And as the time goes, a change request comes by, and the change request is typically that with the this with while they are analyzing the sales amount and sales quantity, they also want to see how they want to compare it with their last year sales amounts and sales quantities. So typically requirement is they want to compare their current year sales amount and sales quantities with their last year sales amounts and sales quantities. So what we would do in such a situation and what we usually do in such a requirement before calculation groups came into play is we built two separate measures to cater this requirement. We would have a separate measure called last year sales amount, to which would typically refer to the base measure sales amount to provide the last year sales amount level analytics. And then you would have another measure called last year sales quantity, which would refer into the last sales quantity base measure to provide you with last year's sales quantity analytics. But when after calculation groups came into play, this is typically not the right way of going about these kind of requirements anymore. You don't need to create separate measures to each and every time, each and every requirement that you might have. There are requirements like the requirement that you see in the screen right now, uh, or any other time intelligence requirement, which can be catered, which can be facilitated with calculation groups. Now, if we look at how this kind of a requirement or how this kind of a chain request would be fulfilled with calculation groups. So firstly, as usual, you would have the base measures in the data model called sales amount and sales quantity. And these base measures would be referring into a calculation group that's created called time intelligence. So this calculation group would have a calculation item which would store the repeating logic, which would store the last year logic that should be used to provide last year analytics. And what actually happens is that the base measures sales amount and sales quantity would refer to this calculation item last year in the calculation group time intelligence to provide last year level analytics, right? That's typically how it happens. So whenever the end users who the business users want to analyze the data with this year's sales amount and last year's sales amount, simply the sales amount base measure would refer into the last year's calculation item, and the last year analytics would be provided with that. Same thing with the sales quantity as well. So this is typically how you would go about such a requirement in Power BI. There are such a requirement with calculation groups. So that pretty much tells you a bit about calculation groups. So firstly, we looked at what is calculation groups and the platforms you can use the calculation groups and the components in a calculation group. And afterwards, we looked at an example in a calculation group, which I believe you got a clearer understanding of what calculation groups are. Even if you don't, that's completely fine, because the next up we'll be looking at a demo which you would get a clearer understanding or a better understanding of what I am actually talking about. Right. With that in mind, I would like to uh, get yourselves into my demo environment today. So my demo environment would be typically a Power BI desktop file. And this is typically my Power BI desktop file. And if you look at this Power BI desktop file, you can see that the requirement that was previously, I'm sorry, the requirement that was previously are, let's select 1 year over here. Right, maybe let's go with to 2013 for now. Yeah, that's decent enough. So this is typically my Power BI desktop file, and you can see that the requirement that we discussed previously, or the change request that was discussed previously, is addressed in this particular desktop file. So what was the requirement that we was previously, the change request that previously came up with the previous example? So to say that, once again, let's just head back into our presentation. And the requirement was typically, as I told you, you have two measures, base measures in a data model, sales amount and sales quantity. And typically, the end business users wanted to see the last year's sales amounts and sales quantities with the current year's sales amounts and sales quantities as well. So to cater that, typically fulfilling that requirement was what we were supposed to do. And without calculation groups, in this particular desktop file, you can see that this requirement is fulfilled. Now you can see in this table that you see on, yeah, let me give you a clear view. Oh, it's still small. I hope that's, oh, okay. So if you look at this particular table in this desktop file, you can see that requirement is clearly fulfilled, right? For example, it shows you. Now, it's not very compelling. I get it. It's just a table, but uh, yeah, let's assume that that you have really nice visuals and everything's all good, but it's just a table here for now. So let's just stick with it, because the purpose of this session is to actually show you around calculation groups and not visualizations and everything. So yeah, so this might not look the best. So yep. Okay. With that in mind, back to the topic, you can see that the requirement is fulfilled here, right? You can see that um, you can see that for each year, whatever the year that you might select over here. So 2013 is selected, and for whatever the year you might select, you can see that the current year sales quantity is shown as sales quantity, and the last year's sales quantity is shown beside that particular uh, current year sales quantity. And then you have the sales amount, you have the current year sales amount, and you have the last year's sales amount as well, right? So you can see that the requirement is fulfilled here, but calculation groups are not used in this requirement. And to show you how the last year requirement is fulfilled, or the last year change request is fulfilled, I would head back into the pane, fields pane that in the right hand side of my screen. And you can see that the last years I had created two separate measures. Uh, yeah, we can. I have created two separate measures for last year's sales amount and for last year's sales quantity. And if you look at each of these measures, so this is the last year's sales amount measure, and this is the last year's sales quantity measure, right? And if you look at these measures, let me just zoom this into you so that, yeah, that's way better. Now, if you look at these two measures, you can clearly see that there is a repetition in the logic, right? You can see that for last year's sales amount, you typically use the same logic that you see right here and the same logic that appears right here. Uh, and for last year's sales quantity, once again, the same logic here and the same logic here, right? The only difference between these two measures is the base measure, right? For example, the last year's sales quantity is referring to the sales quantity base measure, and the last year's sales amount is referring to the sales amount base measure, right? So you can clearly see a repetition in these two measures, right? So the purpose of a calculation group is to avoid this or eliminate or minimize this repetition as much as possible between the measures, right? How does that happen? To say that, let's create a calculation group and uh, work things out. Now, the first thing that you want to create a calculation group is Tabular Editor, right? You need to ensure that you have Tabular Editor installed in your local machine. Now, where does in terms of Tabular Editor, where it appears as whenever. So first thing you need to do is install Tabular Editor in your local machines. Just need to go search for Tabular Editor download and simply download the Tabular Editor, go through the wizard and install the Tabular Editor. And afterwards, what you want to do is open any Power BI desktop file or a new Power BI desktop file. And in the top tab, in the tabs that you see on the top, or the menu items that you see on the top bar in Power BI, you would see a new option or a new item, menu item or a tab called external tools. So inside these external tools, when you click on external tools, you would see Tabular Editor. If you don't click on it, you would not see Tabular Editor. And if you had not installed Tabular Editor in your local machines, this external tools tab might not show up as well if you don't have any other external tools installed, obviously. Yeah, so to make sure that this external tools tab appears, you want to make sure that you had installed Tabular Editor in your local machine. You had installed Tabular Editor in your local machine. And yeah, that's simply about it. Once you install Tabular Editor in your local machine, and once you open any Power BI desktop file, you should be able to see the option or the tab called External Tools. And inside that tab, you should be able to see Tabular Editor, right? So that's where you find Tabular Editor. And when you click on Tabular Editor itself, you would be prompted a window like you see in the screen right now. Now, what had happened is your model is open in this external tool called Tabular Editor. Now, Tabular Editor has many more features and functionalities that you can play around with, but my intention in this session is to show you how to get yourselves around the feature calculation groups, right, with Tabular Editor. So without further ado, let's head right into it. So once you open Tabular Editor, which is under the external tools, you would see a side panel in the left-hand side of the screen, as you may see right now. And in this side panel, you would see multiple folders, right? But for calculation groups, what's the folder that matters for us is the tables folder, which would store all the tables in our data model, right? So how do you create a very basic calculation group? The first thing that you want to do is navigate yourself into this tables folder. And afterwards, what you want to do is right click, then click on create new, and afterwards click on calculation group. And also you can use the shortcut keys Alt 7 without going through the process to create a calculation group as well. But since I cannot show that in my own keyboard, this is the most visible way in which this is the most feasible way in which which I can show you how to create a calculation group. So I'd rather go with this option. So firstly, once again, as I told you, navigate yourselves into the tables folder in your tabular editor and click on create new. And under create new, you would see the option to create a calculation group. Click on calculation group. Uh, and after you click on calculation group, a new calculation group will appear under the tables folder that is called by default as new calculation group. Now, next up is you just want to give this calculation group a proper name, right? So the name that I would give to my calculation group as for the example in my slide deck is time intelligence, right? So my calculation group name is time intelligence. So what I do is I would simply do that. Uh, I create a new calculation group called time intelligence. And inside that calculation group, now after I provide a name to this calculation group and after I click on the enter in my keyboard, after I simply deselect it, you would see the calculation group with the name that you had specified. In this case, it's time intelligence, right? And when you simply click on the drop down icon right next to the calculation group that you created, you can see two items, two typically components inside this calculation group. The first component, we discussed it a little bit previously as well, calculation items, which would store the calculation logic. And the next component, it appears with the title name. And this is nothing but the attribute name or the column name that would uh, typically the name of the column or the name of the attribute that would store these logic or that would store these calculation items, right? That is a bit about that. And the first thing what we would do next is we had created a calculation group. We had provided an appropriate name to the calculation group. And next up, what I want to do is to create a calculation item inside this calculation group, right? Now, what do you think would be our what do you think would be the name of our calculation group, calculation item? Guess what? It's last year, right? As per what you see, so we created the calculation group called time intelligence, and inside that calculation group, we are actually creating a calculation item called last year, right? So the name of our calculation item would be last year. And how you would create a calculation item inside this calculation group is firstly head into the calculation group itself, and inside the calculation group, right click on calculation items and click on the option that would appear saying new calculation item. And this way you can create a new calculation item, and a new calculation item would be named as new calculation by default. Let's rename it to last year as per what we were supposed to do. And now we have a calculation item called last year right inside our time intelligence calculation group. Now, inside this particular calculation item that we created, we want to make sure that we store the repeating logic, right? If not, it's not going to work out, right? Now, for that, firstly, we need to understand what is our repeating logic. We went through this previously as well. So our repeating logic is typically everything that appears here except this base measure, right? You can see that last year's sales amount and in last year's sales quantity, all the logic, the entire logic is repeating except the base measure. If, for example, in last year's sales quantity, you can see the base measure sales quantity, and in the last year's sales amount, you can see the base measure sales amount, right? And so this is typically our repeating logic. But without just breaking this down, what we would do is, since like the majority of this logic is duplicating and only the sales amount is not repeating, without with only the since only the sales amount is not repeating, I would simply just take a copy of this entire logic because the majority of the logic is replicating. And I would next up, what I would do is I would head into my tabular editor once again. And in the tabular editor, I would head into the time intelligence calculation group that we created. And inside this calculation group, I would navigate myself into the last year calculation item that we created. And when you click on the last year calculation item, you can see that in the right hand side of your screen, you would get something called an expression editor would show up. Now, I believe most of you guys might be from an IT background, and you might be have got the opportunity to use various editors for coding at certain stages in your life, right? Uh, uh, so you might so there are like so many editors. Even Notepad++ is but the most common and the most well-known editor is actually Notepad++. And that editor, typically the purpose of the editor is that it helps you to build your code, right? Build your code with proper intelligence and everything that's related to that. So not gonna talk much about editors, but in here, it's something similar as well, right? We simply store, this is basically the expression editor is basically the interface that's given to us to typically store the logic that we have in the respective calculation item. So we had just taken a copy of this particular logic that's repeating from this particular measure. And the next thing that I do is you paste it. Because we already have the logic, we don't need to build that logic in scratch. And you can also just make sure that you validate this a bit if it's all right, if the measure is all right. And also you can do a bit of formatting with the format DAX option that you see right on top to make it much more readable. And that's pretty much the basic measure that we have. That's typically the basic measure logic that we would have. Typically the basic logic that we would have inside our last year calculation item. Now, but still there is one problem, right? This particular logic is only referring to the sales amount base measure, right? It's not referring to the sales quantity base measure, right? So in this case, the values or the values that or the analytics that would be provided would only be the last year sales amount analytics. You don't want that, right? You want to analyze the data with last year sales quantity as well, right? To build that flexibility, to basically allow this measure to use any kind of base measure, we would the first thing that we need to do is simply eliminate the sales amount, right? When you eliminate the sales amount base measure, it's not referring to any base measure to provide you last year analytics, right? And afterwards, we want to make sure that we use a function that is typically used with calculation groups called selected measure, right? Now, once again, if I just take you through what I just did, we have this, we previously had the sales amount based measure over here. And in order to make sure that this works well with this particular logic in this particular calculation item works well with sales quantity and sales amount both, you just need to replace this with replace this with a function called selected measure. And how you would simply, I would simply type that out. It's called selected measure. You want to make sure that you have the parenthesis, and that's typically the function that would be used to capture each and every measure that this particular calculation item is referred to. Now, in the process, there are many a few other functions that you can use at various situations, a few other functions like this that you can use in various situations when you are using calculation groups as well. Some of them are there is another function called is selected measure. There is another function called is selected measure name. So there is another function called selected measure name. So you can simply uh, there is actually a lot of work that you can do, work around this as well. But in this session, I'm just keeping it basic as possible so that you can simply build a very basic calculation item after this session, right? Okay, now, once again, if I just tell you what we have been doing, we had just copied and pasted the existing last year logic, and we had replaced the sales amount that we previously had here, sorry, with something called with a measure with a function called selected measure that would typically capture any kind of uh, measure that this particular calculation item is referred to. And that's typically about it. And I would save this, I would accept changes, and I would save my data model. Uh, so we have everything ready now. We have created the calculation group, calculation items, and typically we have our first calculation group ready to go. And next up, what I do is I would simply save this data model, right? How you would save the data model? As usual with the majority of the software, so whatever the applications that you guys work with, it's just file and save. Or you have the shortcut option to save as well, or save the changes to the connected database. That's typically another option that you have in the plate as well. And so I had saved my data model. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I do have this particular new calculation group in a calculation group in my Power BI data model, right? You can see that the calculation group had already appeared as time intelligence in my Power BI data model, but Power BI is asking us to refresh this manually to ensure that everything works all right with the yellow color warning that you get on top with the refresh now button. So I would simply go ahead with that, and I simply refresh my data model right now, and everything's all good to go. Right now we have the last year figures. We can actually look at last year analytics with the time intelligence calculation group. So how would we do that? The only thing that we want to do is typically get this particular uh, attribute that's inside the time intelligence calculation group. In this stage, it's not renamed to a very user-friendly name or anything. It's just with the default name, but you can rename it to any appropriate name as well. So this is typically my calculation. So what I do is I navigated myself to the time intelligence calculation group, right? And inside the time intelligence calculator group, I navigated myself to the attribute or the column name that I told you guys previously, which is called name. And I just referred it to a slicer, which is a filter, to simply show you the effect of these of the calculation group, right? Uh, Now to show you this very basically, to show you this, the basics of this, uh, how this basically works, I would simply get two measures. I would simply get two cards. One card would have the sales amount, and I would simply get the copy of the same card, and instead of the sales amount, I would have sales quantity in another card. All right. Now, keep in mind that we had selected the year 2013, and the year before that is 2012, right? So when you click on this slicer option, let me just format this a little bit as well. So when you click on this slicer option called last year, you would typically see the figures of 2012. And if when you deselect it, you would see the figures of 2013, because with the last year option, it simply takes your figures 1 year back and it shows you the figures that year that are 1 year behind. Now you can see that rather than creating separate measures for last year's sales amount and sales quantity, you can simply do that with your base. You can simply look at your last year figures with your base measures, right? With the calculation group, right? So in here, you can clearly see that the repetition of logic or the repetition of the measures with the same logic is eliminated, right? You don't want to use the measures with the same logic anymore to cater analytics like this. So you can simply use calculation groups instead. And if you just move an year back, you can clearly see the effect of this, right? Now, so firstly, now, now look at this clearly. Firstly, I created 20. Now this, what you see in the screen right now is 2013 data, 2013 sales amount and 2013 sales quantity. And when you click on the last year option, you would get the last year sales amount and the last year sales quantity. And if I deselect the last year option, and if I go into my year filter or the year slicer once again and click on 2012, you can literally see the same figure, right? You can literally see the same figure that you saw previously with the last year option. Here we are actually going and we are actually uh, clicking on the 2012 option, 2012 item, slicer item, to make sure that we see the 2012 figures. But without doing that, if you click on the 2013 and if you click on the last year, which obviously would be 2012, you can see the 2012 figures, right? So that's simply the basic effect of the calculation group. And I hope you got an understanding of what calculation groups are and the purpose of calculation groups, and how simply how you can create a very basic calculation group. And that simply wraps up my session today. So thank you very much, Azan, once again for giving me this opportunity as usual. Uh, Really happy to contribute to this community. And I'm hoping to contribute to this community further as well. So thank you very much, Azan, for this opportunity. And I guess it's good night back in Bangladesh. So good night, everyone. Yeah. Uh, Hope everyone had a great session. Hope everyone learned something out of that session. So once again, Asan, thank you very much for having me in.
Thank you, Thimantha. Thank you very much. I know you
Thank you
are
very much as well.
spending very much busy time, and
Thank you,
in
Andrew.
this busy time, you have arranged time with the community.
Yeah.
Thanks for thanks a lot for that. Um, Thank you, everyone. Uh, we have several events in today's event today, and we have very interesting topics has discussed with by the speakers, and we are very much grateful to our honorable speakers. They are voluntarily giving their effort towards the community development and the network between the professionals different from the different parts of the world, and they are giving it lots of effort. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Uh,
Right. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you,
Thank
Hassan.
you, Azan. See you
Thank you.
guys. Thank you.
See you, everyone. Thank you all.
Uh,
Thank you.
Thank you all. We are very much grateful to the audience who are um, viewed our session. It's long session today for 4 and 21 hours, and we are hopeful that it will be helpful for your career, and it will be helpful also for the productivity of your concerned project. Thank you, everyone. And our next session will be on the 15th of October. And till now, goodbye. Thank you very much. Goodbye.